Mention of the First World or the Third World, and people imagine extremes of nationhood. The United States, Europe, and Japan at the one end, and developing nations of Asia and Africa at the other end. But what of the Second World, the scores of countries in between? Our next guest has a provocative thesis that in the emerging global order, these Second World nations will have an enormous role to play. With us is Parag Khanna, a young scholar of the New America Foundation and author of The Second World: Empires and Influence in the New Global Order. Parag, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much.
So this is a prophecy basically about power and influence in the 21st century. And in a lot of these places, the balance of power is a lot more fluid than it is today. And instead of one superpower, we have three all vying for control of certain marketplaces. Talk about what you think happened to the old world order and why did it disappear?
That's an excellent question. It isn't so much a prophecy, of course, because I'm talking about the world as I see it today rather than the world as it's going to be. And part of that is the answer to your question, which is what happened to the old world order. The old world order, which people believed was the American world, the post-Cold War American-dominated world in the absence of the Soviet Union, disappeared a lot faster than people ever thought that it would. And the reason has a lot to do with globalization. People believe that globalization was synonymous with Americanization, but in fact globalization is this all-encompassing reality that has spread power and technology and resources around the world to rising powers such as the European Union and China, and to a lesser extent India and Brazil, and then there's the question of Russia and so forth. But the fact is that power has diffused very quickly away from the United States. And so we've arrived at a new world order, and it's a very different one from the one that people expected in America in the 1990s.
And in the context of your book, how do you define globalization?
I actually take a macro perspective on globalization in two ways. First, I say that globalization is not just a trend. The U.S. National Intelligence Council and other agencies used to do reports saying globalization is one of many trends. And then they would say it's a meta trend, meaning it's bigger than just any other trend. I see globalization as the all-encompassing reality of the world. Now, it's in different degrees, in different places, in different intensities and geographies, but it is the common denominator of the global order. Now, for thousands of years, that was not the case. Geopolitics was the driving principle, the rise and fall of empires and the conflict among a leading power and its challenger. To me, globalization is the new bottom line, the new fundamental framework, the new all-encompassing reality. The second way in which I treat globalization a bit differently from other people is that I don't treat it as just a question of intensifying economic phenomena. Rather, to me, globalization is something that comes in different forms depending on who is using it. I believe that there's an American way of driving globalization to pursue American interests and to Americanize the world. I believe there's a European way of using globalization to pursue a Europeanizing world. And then there's a Chinese way of doing globalization. So
and these are the three superpowers that you effectively talk about: China, the United States, and the European Union. And
right.
All of these superpowers are trying to nuzzle up to these second world countries.
Yes, they are.
Talk a little bit about these second world countries. Give them a name and define them. What is a second world country?
Right. Second world. The status of Second World is something that's both geographic and temporal. It's geographic in the sense that these are strategic countries lying along and between the major empires in the world, the US, EU, and China. So it's countries in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, South America, across the Middle East and Southeast Asia. And it's also a temporal category because it's the state of being where you are not First World or Third World, or actually somewhere balanced in between, but both at the same time. And what's happening in many countries in the world is that they are split between winners and losers economically, politically, and otherwise, something that is exacerbated or intensified by globalization and by the competition of the empires. So it's a very tense state of being to be in the Second World. I chose countries where I'm not quite sure, and where even after traveling there for months and years, I'm not sure whether 5 or 10 years from now they will have risen into the First World or fallen into the Third World. And that state of uncertainty is a very Second World kind of condition.
What makes these countries important, and also just describe briefly their relative strengths and weaknesses?
Well, one can hardly generalize almost about the Second World. Sometimes it's a charismatic leader that is pulling the country forward. Sometimes it's a natural resource that's being exploited. Sometimes it is a superpower patron who's helping them sort of bootstrap. So there's many different things about them. But if you take the countries, what makes them very significant are their strategic resource and their geography, the access that they give to the superpowers, to entire regions. And in fact, they're countries that are strategic enough that based on what they do, other countries may follow suit or react against them. So when Kazakhstan makes a decision to be pro one side, Uzbekistan may decide to do something else. When Venezuela decides one thing, Brazil may decide another. When Saudi Arabia decides one thing, Iran may decide another. And these are examples of second world countries that are very strategic, that are coming up in the news quite regularly, and that I don't believe that we understand well enough, both what they are and how they think.
And talk a little bit about the demise of American power. What, in your view, are the underlying causes that accelerated this slide, and what does the future hold for the United States in this new world order? I mean, I know you say it's the world as you see it now, but right now America is still the only singular superpower.
There are many ways to look at it. I have argued in this book that the US, EU, and China represent three distinct worldviews and systems that are trying to project their values out into the second world and beyond, and trying to become the leading dominant power, in the US's case, to remain that way. So it's a question of whether one is looking at just how much power they have, and then you have to measure power. Is it economic power? Is it military power, diplomatic power, and so on? So population power, like what China has, or economic power that the EU
you suggest that the United States no longer has a hegemony in the world,
exactly,
because it's sharing it with these two other superpowers.
Exactly, right.
So it's something's been lost.
Right.
I mean,
the US most certainly has to become more accustomed to a more sort of humble role in the world. And as I said earlier, globalization and the spread of power and technology around the world is certainly one reason why America's dominant position has eroded so quickly. I do think that that will continue. I think that there is a potential for some kind of equilibrium among the three, but it isn't quite clear when that will happen. Only that I believe it's very much necessary, because I don't think that the US could ever restore its dominant position.
Well, you talk about America getting its exceptionalist principles back. I mean, what do you mean by that?
It does have American exceptionalism is a view that all empires have of themselves. It's a self-perception as much as it is anything else. Do I believe that America represents certain values of liberalism and democracy which hold a certain amount of inspirational value around the world? Yes, but the question is always how it chooses to export them. When you asked what has happened to erode American power, the last 8 years have shown that the way in which America pursues its exceptional agenda or exceptionalist agenda have proven perhaps counterproductive. So the next administration, and beyond that as well, and the country as a whole, in fact, and the society and how America presents itself around the world, as its citizens do as well, needs to perhaps change in order to succeed in remaining exceptional.
We are in the middle of an election year. I mean, do you see any one single US presidential candidate who's able to turn it around for America?
I don't think that anyone can turn it around. One can slow or reverse slightly the negative perception of the United States. I certainly think that, as many others do, that Barack Obama has the kind of identity advantage, if you will, in the sense that he can be identified with by many people around the world, and perhaps does a better job.
Are you in his camp?
Yes.
So you're advising him?
Yes.
Right. And let's just very briefly take a couple of foreign policy issues. Iraq, what do you think that's going to look like in a year's time?
I think that we will probably have dramatically diminished our troop presence by that time. I think that I'm not so sure about the stability of the country's parliament and its political structures at the moment, and so we might 1 year from now be slightly closer to an inevitable partition than we are now. I believe in any case, in my personal analysis, that we're heading in that direction, that everything that we're doing right now is just to pretend like that isn't going to happen, but I simply believe that it will. So Iraq 1 year from now will have fewer American troops and be closer to division.
And what do you think that the new president has to get to? What's the one issue of crucial importance day one in the White House?
I try actually not to prioritize in that way. I actually think that if America
is it
wants
Iraq,
to be...
the Middle East, North Korea, Iran, I mean...
And it's everything. And part of what I argue in the article that I just wrote in the New York Times is that we need to have a more decentralized decision-making structure in foreign policy so that we do not prioritize among issues that in fact are simultaneously occurring, but can actually deal with all of them at the same time. That is what a global power is supposed to do, and that is what the government should be structured to do, but it is not at present.
And just before we wrap up our conversation, you traveled to many, many countries when you were writing this book. What's the one place that intrigued you the most?
I'll give you a couple if I can. I mean, my favorite countries from my travels, both before this book and for this book, have always been Turkey and Lebanon and Malaysia. And I would say those are my three favorites. They also make for three excellent holiday destinations for any viewers who are interested.
Right. Okay. Well, Parag Khanna, thank you very much for joining us on the program.
Thank you so much.